the next reality is it's upon us. Like you use the term portal. Yeah, we're stepping through a gateway, and as we go through that gateway, it's not going to be as cataclysmic. I don't feel it will be as cataclysmic as we may try to make it be. You know, it's very subtle, and it happens bit by bit, piece by piece, and there's an ascension that takes place.
Before we jump into today's episode, I want to thank those of you who've become proximity sponsors at Patreon. For $5 a month, you can make sure that this show continues to deliver top quality content as we seek to make an impact on our fractured perceptions and relationships. If you haven't done so yet, please take a moment to subscribe as a supporter on Patreon. You can also help us by sharing this podcast on social media and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Every little bit helps, and it's all about mutuality. Thank you. In today's episode of the Proximity Podcast, Jason and I settle into this journey and lay out some of the driving ideas of this show, including something called the prophetic imagination. We'll talk a little about what that means and how it relates to the present moment and beyond. I'll share a bit of my recent journey from Hawaii, where I lived for the past 4 years, teaching in a Hawaiian culture-based high school, and my subsequent road trip from California to my new home in Columbia, Missouri. We'll talk about our perceptions of new places we visit and how they're affected by our positionality and Google Earth. We reflect on recent election results, including a major upset victory in Missouri, where Black Lives Matter activist Cori Bush unseats a political dynasty in the 1st Congressional District. And Virginia's Jennifer Carroll Foy could be on her way to becoming the state's first female governor and first African-American female governor in the United States. And, of course, the recent news of Senator Kamala Harris becoming Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden's running mate. What could these events mean for our perceptions of possibilities? And of course, we reflect on language and how reality is or isn't defined by it, how hegemony is perpetuated within digital spaces, and how the consolidation of media messages work against previous utopian expectations that more information would mean democratization. And this leads us into the idea of the prophetic imagination. We look at it from the religious perspective, but we also consider the prophetic in secular discourse and how these ideas of potentiality may intersect in the socio-political realm and an alternative consciousness. And this is just the beginning of that line of inquiry. We want our listeners to be doers of the word, not just hearers, so you can expect that Jason and I will give you a little homework at the end of each podcast. So, let's get ready to ascend to the message. Welcome to you, Jason.
Hey, man. How's it going?
It's going well. Getting settled in over here in Missouri. So for those of you who don't know, I moved from Hawaii, where I lived the last 4 years. We'll probably refer to that section of my life quite a bit on this show because it was sort of a reset for me in life. And about a month ago, my fiance and 2 children and I, we moved, flew from Honolulu to California, stayed there a couple weeks, and then we did an extensive COVID-19 road trip.
Yeah.
And it was beautiful, man. It was gorgeous.
So you guys drove from California all the way to Missouri?
Yeah, we left from Laguna Hills, where my brother lives. Met a friend up in Pasadena who will definitely be on this show. Her name is Justine Segal, the first female Major League Baseball coach.
Oh, wow.
Was my closest friend in college. and she's done some pretty amazing things since then. So we'll definitely have her. She gave me some great advice on the PhD program that I'm about to enter into, because she earned her doctorate, and her advice to me was get in and get out.
Absolutely.
If it were only that easy.
Right. Right.
Yeah. And then we took off from there, and we decided to go, to the Grand Canyon, and drove up through, before that we hit Sedona, Arizona, which you need to go to.
Yeah. Well, if you recommend it, I'm going, because based upon the last trip, when we went to Garden of the Gods in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Oh my goodness, me and Nicholas O'Rourke, Father Ishak, we still talk about that to this day. I'm trying to get my wife to go back too. So that's most definitely just one of those most breathtaking, life-changing experiences that, oh my goodness, you think you step out of your normal life into the next realm, heavenly realm. It's just amazing,
And if you thought that, about Garden of the Gods, which I think is magical, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
Sedona, Arizona is kind of known for its, there's a lot of new agey things that go on there, but the belief is that there are vortexes in that region. And, I use different language to describe phenomenon like that, but I would say it definitely has some very interesting energetic presences.
Well, you got to think Native Americans, that's in that area. They're the tribal indigenous people of these areas, that's meaning that this is their land, originally is their land. So, they were able to be free to do whatever it is that they did without any inhibitions, so I'm pretty sure, they've left their mark. Even here in Virginia, where I'm at, we have the Jamestown settlement up in Williamsburg, which is maybe about, I guess, 45 minutes to an hour away from where I am.
Wow.
And in that area, you can feel it. Even 400 some odd years later, when you're in that area, you can most definitely feel the energy of the area, which is interesting because of what we have transpiring in the state of Virginia. We have the first ever African American female running for governor, and I think that she's going to have a really good chance of doing something historical here, and so it kind of just will bring things full circle in this particular area. So
it's going on everywhere. I mean,
it's going on absolutely everywhere, man.
We stopped in Sedona on our narrative here, but the truth is, after Sedona, and I'm coming back to what you said,
right?
After Sedona and the Grand Canyon, we just decided we needed to get to where we were going in Columbia, Missouri.
Right?
Which is interesting because we went through the Rocky Mountains. We actually met Mother Sarah, or Mashonda Lindsay.
Oh wow!
She just happened to be in the mountains with her husband Cajardo and her two boys, and they're men now. Right. And she'll be on the show. There's another person. And so it was just kind of amazing that we rolled in there and had a quick lunch, and then we didn't even stop in Denver, which is was my hometown for 10 years.
Wow. Yeah.
And I had a business there, and a lot of my teaching career started there, and it just we just went straight on through. We didn't even stop, and then we just flew through where was it, Kansas? I think it was Kansas. Yeah, all the way, man. And it was exhausting.
Wow.
But when we got here to Columbia, I know two people, and they're both faculty at the University of Missouri, and I haven't seen either one of them yet. I picked up my books that I mailed to one of them on their porch front. He left them out for me on the porch. Other than that, we haven't seen a soul other than going to the grocery store and things like that. So it's pretty surreal still.
Yeah.
But because I want to go, I'd like to just start off with going by the recent news going on in these primary elections,
right,
and your election. And then we just had right here in Missouri, and I know nothing about local politics here yet.
Right.
Just like when I was in Hawaii, it took me about a year or so, and then I started to get to know who the key players were and all that.
Right.
And so here I know very little.
Hmm.
So just last week, Cori Bush,
Right.
activist in St. Louis for BLM and working class, unseated some dynasty, pretty much a family
Wow.
dynasty, democratic dynasty, I should say.
Wow.
So it's pretty much a sure bet she's going all the way to Congress.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think she's a single mother too, a
Single
nurse.
mother. She's a nurse. She got diagnosed with COVID twice.
Wow.
So, I mean, and then, when I first heard it, I was like, oh, that's cool. That's interesting. I got to get on this and figure out who, but then I heard her speak
Yeah.
and, she's a preacher
Yeah. The
and,
passion. You can hear the passion
whole,
ringing out.
and then, you have that energy of the passion, but then behind it, you could just feel this clarity of
Yeah.
purpose,
Hmm.
and so I'm still floored by that. So we got
Right.
that going on over here. And then I just learned what you were telling me today.
Yeah.
So
Over here in Virginia, Jennifer Carroll Foy is her name. She's from Petersburg, Virginia. She was raised by her grandmother. She went to VMI, graduated from VMI. That's predominantly male, white school, predominantly white male school. So she's one of the few females to actually graduate from that school. She actually ran for, I guess she was one of the House delegates, one of the delegates. She ran for that, and she actually got that. She was pregnant while she was on the campaign trail, actually, with twins. Can you believe that?
it
So
makes me feel like, I don't know. I just can't, that's where it's at.
right,
The
right,
women,
right.
I'm imagining like my limited capacities as a,
Absolutely.
you know,
And then
my,
the vice presidential announcement. We can talk about that as well. Um,
absolutely.
I don't know how to pronounce her name correctly. It's
Kamala Harris, well, I've
I want
heard
to
it
say
two different ways.
Kamala,
Yeah.
Kamala,
Kamala.
right,
Right.
Senator Harris. So that's another major piece as well. And none of this to me or to you either. None of this is surprising to any of us. To you, Rai. Because for so long we've had the patriarchy. I can call it that. I use that term. We've had the patriarchy
Absolutely. Yeah.
and this very masculine energy that's been over our entire world, actually, for as far as the history books can tell. That I know, every history book that I know has that. And so now it's swinging back. I feel the pendulum is swinging back towards this feminine essence that I think will do us some real good. And I think that those the masculine energy that is, I'll say it that way because I want to be sensitive completely to the dynamics of our world.
Well, you're
Of our
addressing, other realms, and so like, I'll just do this part.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
So the white male hegemony.
Yes. Yes.
Those of my ancestry and gender dominated, the political landscape and determined, histories written by those in power.
Mm-hmm.
And for the most part, and we've seen, push back against that. And that's part of what this show is about. But we haven't seen it like manifest in a way that I think is coming, and in a way that I'm extremely excited and grateful for. We'll get into this later in the shows. There's a lot of soul searching going on.
Yep.
And then there's a lot of defensiveness going on.
Yeah.
Those of my background, and I understand it really well. I'm privy to some of the conversations that are had that play into that narrative. But it's important to understand too, though, that this is primarily true in the Western context, because you go to other, there are many cultures, that have never lost touch of the feminine, and I make a distinction. I think they're connected between the feminine and the divine feminine, when it comes to the cosmology and spirituality of different cultures and that sort of thing. But of course, given the facts of history over the last 500-600 years, maybe a little longer, you have this sort of hegemony, what I was just referring to before, and that's been exported via imperialism and the conflicts between, of course, Soviet Union, United States, formerly drawing on, economic ideologies. But all of that plays out. And in our sense of history and our sense of perception and time, which we like to talk about a lot.
Yep.
When I was driving, and I'm sorry for going off on this tangent.
No, it's fine. No, it's relevant. Go ahead.
When we came down and you see Sedona, and for those of you who've been to Sedona, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You got to go at certain times of the day to get the true magic, break of dawn, and at sunset, where the sun just lights up and illuminates these massive, rock figurations. And it's just amazing. My mind went to, and I remember saying this to my fiance, hey, can you imagine what it would have been like to be the first people, when I say people, now I'm talking about quote unquote Americans, not the indigenous people,
right?
But just to roll up on that with a covered wagon. I mean, just for any human being, I think it would be just phenomenal. Right. So that's the kind of thought that I was going through my head. And then I asked myself, it's funny that I thought of it that way instead of, what would have been like in the minds of somebody just rolling up on that for the first time without without having photos on, Facebook or, through social media or online, being able to see it before you see it, sort of thing.
Right.
It just changes our perception of spatial and all that kind of stuff. When I moved to Hawaii, I Googled and Google Earthed almost every street in the town that I was going to live in. So when I got there, it's still a new experience, but it's a strange one because you have this map imprinted in your brain.
Right.
I don't know why I went there.
Because to come upon something that you've never seen before. I was listening to Alan Watts' lecture the other day, and he was saying that if you cannot find words to describe a thing, then it doesn't exist. I think he said something like that. He's like, you can't, unless you can find the words to describe it, it's not there. Because you want to immediately define it. You want to try to make it something. And you can't, even now I'm speaking, right? I'm utilizing the words to be able to articulate my thoughts. Otherwise I'm going to be in silence and you'll think that nothing's going on. Even though my thoughts are actually, taking place. You don't know that unless I define them by my words, right?
Of course. And then in the professional fields of language, they debate about this sort of thing. Like, well, what is going on outside of language? Like our perceptions and stuff like that. How much is language bound versus there are other ways of perceiving concepts and things like that. But I sort of weigh in on the side that language does construct most of our reality. And then of course, then there's all these arguments, deep arguments about epistemology and how we know what we know. And I used to do this experiment with my students all the time. Usually any class that I teach, I always start with just getting them to start to question the foundations of what we assume to be true. And so I always ask the question whenever I start anywhere, it's like, how do you know what you know?
Right.
And for me, that's fundamental in establishing any sort of claim, whether it's what's for dinner or what's, the nature, is there such a thing as natural law or something like that? What is history?
Right. Well, I start to think about, like, for first thing that comes to my mind is that experience that you had. You said Sedona is the name of it?
Sedona, Arizona.
Sedona, Arizona. Yep. Like, and you talked about that experience. Like, how would you describe that experience? What feeling was it? What was that experience? Like, immediately when you're feeling whatever you're feeling, when you saw whatever you saw, the mind seeks to find a word to label that so that you can make a connection with it, So that's the first thing. And then the other part of it is I know I'm jumping on two different things here. To me,
So I'll be the person who just says, there's lots of prophet lying going on out there.
yeah.
I mean, I'm not going to mention any names. I
Well,
might,
would you want to talk
but it's
about
like,
the responsibility of, I think what differentiates it is the responsibility of those who have that influence. And I'm going to bring up Kanye West. I'm going to say his name. I'm going to bring it up because that's exactly what I'm talking about. And I like Kanye West, right? I think he has some great ideas, but I think that for, unfortunately, some of them that he has are way too far off. Like they're for a very futuristic type of person, and that's not, I don't think that that's, you can't make that leap.
there's
You
so
can't
many
make that leap.
factors involved in the dynamic entity that is Kanye West, in the sense of,
Yeah.
and I'm no expert by any means, but, you have, first of all, when you bring wealth into the equation and this
Yeah.
sort of, it allows you some sense of detachment in many ways. And I'm not going to sit and try to describe him. I have sort of, there's certain things I love, and then there's certain things that, the red flags go up for me
Yeah.
when it comes to him. But I mean, I don't know him personally,
Right.
but at the same time, he's occupying a certain space,
Yep.
and that's, I think, what we're talking about when it comes to, there are different voices, and when you say for better or for worse,
Yeah.
there's, look, Donald Trump, say his name,
Yeah.
to name an entity very
Absolutely.
real, is occupying a certain space. And I agree with someone like an Andrew Yang and other people who have talked about, when they talk about Trump, they say, people act as if he is the problem. Now, I'm not going to with our society, but I would agree that Donald Trump is occupying a space, and so in that sense, he would be more symptomatic of
Yes.
something else that's going on.
Yes. Somebody has to buy into it.
So there is a for better for worse when it comes to the prophetic and that sort of thing. And there's a proprietary nature of that inside of churches and stuff like that. People are not, I mean, we live in the age of social media, so people are not unaccustomed to knowing and hearing some of the stuff that is often ridiculed and that sort of thing. But then we bring it back to, all of us are leaning towards a certain sound, or we're
Yeah.
leaning towards, we have an inclination, a proclivity towards the type of information that we resonate with.
Yeah.
The question is, where are we resonating from?
Yeah.
And because all you have to do is think about your life, reflect on it, and you can think of times where you, quote unquote, resonated with something that you later completely turned against, whether like an ideology,
That's right.
so to speak, and so that would be one example of that. So I think, when it comes to the prophetic, one of the things I want to do on this show, and again, I'm not just talking about religion, I'm talking about the prophetic imagination, and I'll bring up Walter Brueggemann in a minute.
Right.
Is again, it's not necessarily predicting anything, although there are people who do that. I mean, I would consider, I'll get in trouble for this, I would consider Karl Marx to be extremely prophetic when it comes
Yeah.
to being able to see into his times and ahead with the Industrial Revolution. And most people who talk about communism or socialism have never even cracked a book, have never read Das Kapital or any of his work and that sort of thing. And I
Right.
think if they did, and like were able to just take off their own propaganda glasses for a moment, they would be able to not necessarily agree with him, but would be able to see that this was a brilliant interaction for the time, and in many ways it was prophetic.
Yeah. Most definitely. Especially based upon where we are right now. I think that, man, when you have that prophetic imagination, you have that, you're a really creative person. You're an extremely creative person, or first of all, I think that you're open. Matter of fact, you are open. I know you're open. You're open to what could be. And it really, to me, is dependent upon your heart towards others. And because you first understand where we are, I think the prophet understands where they are in time, looking around in time, understanding where you are in time, and then having the wisdom and the foresight to educate yourself and say, okay, how can I convey what it is that I'm sensing, hearing, tasting, feeling, and convey it in such a way that that it grows, that it becomes a real life, tangible thing. I think when you read that Brueggemann piece from out of the book we were talking about earlier, that one phrase, it encapsulates everything that I'm trying to say.
Well, we could jump into it real quick. If you guys are interested, I'll post this on the website and on the links to any of these podcasts. But we're referring to a theologian. I believe he's from a Lutheran background. Why am I conjuring up a theologian? Because I think there's a lot of people. So a lot of people who are not religious, so I'm speaking to them right now, when they perceive of the church and that sort of thing, there's sort of these pop culture references and that sort of pigeonhole, Christians into one pot. And so usually what emerges are these people that they see in the media and that sort of thing. Like, I mean, I'll say it, the scary ass Kenneth Copeland,
Billy Graham,
those guys. Yeah. Like, I mean, and they look at that and they're like, how could anyone engage with that who has a sense of rationality? Well, Walter Brueggemann is one of the voices that if you took the time to read him, even if you weren't religious, you can gain this sort of perspective on what we're talking about when we refer to the prophetic imagination, which he wrote a book by that title. And I would just happen to be reading some of it today. So I'll just share a passage from it.
Sure.
This is from the preface of the book, The Prophetic Imagination. He says this: the prophets understood the possibility of change as linked to emotional extremities of life. They understood the strange congruence between public conviction and personal yearning. Most of all, they understood the distinctive power of language.
Yes.
The capacity to speak in ways that evoke newness, fresh from the word. It is argued that the prophetic understanding of reality is based in the notion that all social reality does spring fresh from the word. It is the aim of every totalitarian effort to stop the language of newness. And now we are now learning that where such language stops, we find our humanness diminished. So when people are trying to circumscribe reality by dictating what that reality is for us, that is what Walter Brueggemann is articulating there. And that's actually not what you were talking about just earlier.
But I mean, even that still right there speaks that's not what the phrase, that's not the actual quote I was talking about, but it still fits in line. It most definitely steps right in line with what I'm trying to convey. I mean, he said it in a very articulate, well thought out manner, but that's it. Yeah. That's exactly what I'm talking about.
So when he's talking about the prophetic, he's referring to the biblical exegesis and all that kind of stuff. And he's a scholar, but I love how he can pull that scholasticism and sort of distill it in ways that are really, which talk about like alternative communities. Because when we're talking about speaking into the future, we're looking at alternatives to what is the dominant narrative right now. I'll read what you were talking about right now.
Yeah.
Because speaking of this, what is, how churches behave and that sort of thing is, here it is.
Yeah.
He says this: the contemporary American church is so largely inculturated to the American ethos of consumerism that it has little power to believe or act. Our consciousness has been claimed by false fields of perception and idolatrous systems of language and rhetoric. When I read that, I was like, what were we talking about last week?
Right.
So,
Exactly.
you
That's
know,
exactly it.
I read this book about 8 years ago at the suggestion of Archbishop Farron Ash,
Right.
and because he loved Brueggemann and as a theologian, and I was reading, how did I not see that before? Well, now I'm working on my PhD in language and literacy for social transformation. We talk about, you know, language and rhetoric and language ideology all the time. So now I'm
Right.
reading this, I'm gleaning a whole
And
new
that's what we
perspective.
mean by prophetic. And that's how sometimes the prophetic could seem like it's predicting, it's predictive. Because as Bishop Ash would often say, he would say prophets are always in the next move, while the church or the called out, the ecclesia, the called out ones, while the people are in the current move, and they actually speak backwards. They're actually speaking. They're in the next move, speaking to the people in the current move from the next move. you know,
Right.
and
And at the
so
same time, and so just to clarify that too, because I was listening to his message, getting ready for the
right,
shows that we're going to do about him,
right,
Archbishop Ash, who were both successors in his ministry. But he would also really be critical of movements,
yes, that's right,
because the contemporary churches, they talk about movements or the move of God and all that kind of
right,
stuff. And so what Brueggemann is saying, what Archbishop Ash is saying, and I believe what you're saying,
mhm,
but what I resonate with is we're not necessarily talking about creating new religious movements.
right,
In fact, it's quite the opposite for those of
yep,
us who are familiar with, the ancient apostolic or Orthodox traditions. Um, you can spend a lifetime in that context discovering these mysterious and prophetic moves that are
right,
that are it transcends time and space. And the one beautiful thing about the Orthodox Church is that it is completely imbibed in mysticism,
mm-hmm,
um, and the prophetic. And some people will look at the Orthodox Church, and most people will think Greek Orthodox or Russian Orthodox and that sort of thing. And those who are a little more familiar with the world, they know that the Middle East is full of what we would
Syrian
call,
Orthodox,
exactly,
Coptic Orthodox,
absolutely. And those of us in American context will often look at it and say, well, it just looks like Catholicism to
right,
be, like
right,
we all have these prejudging ideas when it comes to that. I guess I bring that up because the entire liturgical expression of the Orthodox Church is prophetic,
mm-hmm,
meaning it's based on a lot of these mystical ideas. It presents itself in such a way that a lot of people would see it as mundane ritual.
yeah,
But when you dig a little deeper into those writings of the Eastern church fathers, I don't want to get too much into that today.
right,
We'll have people on who can talk about that much better than I can, I guess. So, but it's an important aspect to mention is that when we use the words church, prophetic, religious, and stuff like that, most people, believer or not believer, are referring to things in the Western context.
yeah,
And so some people get all excited when they discover that there are other contexts.
yeah,
I'm not talking about orthodoxy necessarily, but like, someone mentioned earlier today, religious pluralism and like, the breakdown of, what's considered traditional. I guess this is what I'm getting at. What's
mm-hmm,
considered traditional in the United States and in the Western world is actually quite new,
mm-hmm,
historically speaking. A lot of these ideas and these movements
right,
are not what we're talking about um, when we're talking about movement, right?
right, 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 right. Pentecostalism has to be what every bit of, well, I know from my faith tradition, 115, 112, 115 years old, stemming from the Azusa Street revival, back in California. So,
And very much, people are going to hate me for this, so let me say it. Very much. Now, originally, and there's a great book on this by Harvard theologian Harvey Cox, religious studies scholar. He wrote a book called Fire from Heaven.
mm,
Now, this guy is as white as could be, as far from the Pentecostal tradition as could be. But he became fascinated with it because he wrote a book back in the 70s called The Secular City, where he was talking about the post believing church sort of thing, the church that's embedded in society, and the typical liberal side of things where it's all about, the social construct and embodying it. I don't want to get too much into that.
Right.
But he also paired Pentecostalism with jazz, and jazz is a form of music. And so we will do a whole episode on Harvey Cox and Fire from Heaven and Pentecostalism.
I can see that. I can see that, actually. I can clearly see that.
It's a beautiful book. I got in trouble when I was an undergrad because that book just came out when I was graduating. And my professor and my faculty advisor at that time from the program I was in was a big Harvey Cox fan. And the book he's most well known for is The Secular City. And then he wrote another one called Many Mansions, which talked about religious pluralism and all that other kind of stuff. And in the beginning of Fire from Heaven, Harvey Cox sort of recants his earlier work. And we'll get to that premise at another time. Mm-hmm. And when I mentioned that in a presentation I was doing for a colloquium in philosophy and religion, he this professor, he's passed away now and I love him, but he tried to call me out on it saying, that's, I think you're misunderstanding him. And then I just read it, verbatim afterwards. He had not read the book yet. So my point is this, is that the original context of Pentecostalism was very unique. So I don't want to diminish that at all.
Right.
Not only was it diverse, it was one of the first real racially diverse, movement and that sort of thing. There was a lot of really beautiful, powerful things that happened at Azusa and all. And so not taking away from any of that, but very quickly, like any other movement, and this is why movements are different than being rooted in tradition.
Right.
When I say tradition, I'm not meaning it in the limited sense of religiosity.
Right.
I just mean a sense of continuity that's ancient, goes back. It's not born in the late 1800s or early 1900s. It goes back further than that. Right. It goes back further than the Protestant Reformation and European influence and all that kind of stuff. But what happens in the American context with religious movements, and you guys all know this because you see a church on every corner, that kind of thing, is that it gets taken over by our culture.
Yep.
Which is a consumer culture.
Yep.
And with that, if you don't mind, I'll go back to Brueggemann just for a second to hit that other verse, because I know you have something to say on that. He says this, our consumer culture is organized against history. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot more he says on that, but just that line for me is very telling. What is history to people on social media today? Right. They can't even remember that 4 years ago, there was this huge campaign against President Barack Obama, all kinds of media onslaught.
Right.
And you have Donald Trump up there claiming to be the greatest victim, using words like lynched, by the media and things like that. And that's just playing on this idea that culture is organized against history. People have no real frame of reference when it comes to history. And then he says this, a community rooted in energizing memories and summoned by radical hopes is a curiosity and a threat in such a culture. So I feel that this show, you and I, and all those who are looking at these potentialities and recontextualization, because that's really what's going on right now. People are saying, wait, why does it have to be like this?
Time for a new social contract.
A new social contract. And that's what we're talking about when we even mention the prophetic. Now, there's all kinds of dimensions to that. We could talk about theology and all that kind of stuff. But that's really where I was heading with that.
And we're going to come from our influences. We're going to come from those things that we've opened ourselves up to throughout our journey. And that's why you're going to hear me speak a little bit about the church and speak using church language, and also speak about astrology and may even speak about Hermeticism or Freemasonry as much as I can. I mean, there's no secret about that stuff, just the passwords and the grips. I can't tell you all that kind of stuff, but the philosophy is most definitely, you can see it everywhere. You even see it in the Orthodox Church. So I mean, we're looking we're at a pivotal time in our journey as humans, I think, on this planet. We're introducing the next paradigm, the next shift, the next reality it's upon us. Like you use the term portal. Yeah, we're stepping through a gateway, and as we go through that gateway, it's not going to be as cataclysmic. I don't feel it will be as cataclysmic as we may try to make it be. It's very subtle, and it happens bit by bit, piece by piece, and there's an ascension that takes place.
What makes it cataclysmic is our own fears of thinking about a context that is completely well, it's not necessarily foreign, but we just haven't tried it yet. Or the portal is there, and so we're not trying to make any like sort of hyper claims. This is it, we're going through, and
right.
We're going to define this, but it's a scary thing for a lot of people. And for me, we talked about this a little bit a while ago, because I always want to leave this show by giving some homework to people, and so for me, it's about always saying, all right, we need a new social contract. What do we mean by that? Well, what do we want? What do human beings really want? And so I want to ask you, the listener, to be thinking about that too. And I'm not talking about this is not that question, where do you want to be in 5 years from now? Right. That's a very wonderful exercise. Last time on the show, we talked about going back and visiting our former self,
right?
Doing that meditative exercise and going back and, what would you say to yourself when you were 10 or 12 or growing up, or 20? This is actually, and it's not that, and it could be related to that, but it's also not, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Another good exercise. But what we're talking about right now is the world, in a sense, has hit the pause button.
Yep.
The media has not.
Right.
The media is still trying to uphold the same narrative because, and when I say the media, I am not talking about Donald Trump's fake news media. I'm talking about all of it.
Yes.
The corporate media that depends upon fear, number one, and upholding of the status quo and hegemony. And what people are really afraid of is, and this is leading us into some future episodes talking about there's got to be more with Archbishop Ed, is people are afraid of doing anything differently. That's a normal human response to something. I've never done this before, so I'm scared. That's fine. But when it comes to your belief construction and people are asking you, can you just take a step back for a minute and imagine what it would be like in a different economy? Oh, that's never worked. I'm not talking about the isms that you've been programmed to think about, socialism, communism, all that kind of stuff. Although most people, again, don't know what they're talking about when they mention those words. But a portal is terrifying, and it's probably not even that big of a deal. For example, if we all were to agree tomorrow on one particular thing, it would be so. It would be so. And it wouldn't be catastrophic or wrenching once people realized, well, this is not such a bad thing.
Right.
Now, that's different, though. And I have to say this last critical point. That's different than saying, well, then why do you talk about, say, racism, for example? Why don't you move on from that? Because it's so deeply embedded in the entire construct of which we're living in, that you either have to do one of two things: act like it doesn't exist, which many people are doing right now, rewrite history, which many people are doing right now, or realize, see, for me, I feel completely liberated in that sense of, I have no problem. I have no problem whatsoever saying we absolutely live inside that construct. And I'm a beneficiary of that construct.
Right.
And there will be things for the rest of my life that I will discover about that. But there's no way of like snapping your fingers and just saying we're not going to do it like that anymore, because there are inside of this construct, there are all of these other things that we can't see. Generally speaking, the dominant culture definitely can't see it.
Right.
But if you're from a marginalized population, you can't not see it, you know? So when we're talking about transformation and all these kind of things, it's a scary thing for a lot of people. And what we have right now with this pause button hit is that some people are not hitting the pause button. They're not using this opportunity to be reflective on things. They are eating this narrative up. They are eating the narrative up, and it is consuming people, and it is playing on the worst aspects of humanity. And finally, the last thing I'll say on that is if you have any mental health condition, it's going to be exacerbated by this situation because of these bad players who want to keep this narrative going. And I'm tired of this narrative, and I'm ready to, like, you know, blow it out of the water. And that's what proximity means to me, is like getting in your face and allowing you to get in mine and just say, look, there's got to be more than this two-dimensional battle going on. People talking about civil war right now and all this kind of stuff, you know,
right.
All of these are within the realm of possibility.
Yeah. But it's a time to rest and digest. There's flight and fight.
It is.
And then there's rest and digest. And this is the time for resting and digesting. It really is. I mean, this is an invitation to a deep sense of self-reflection. And a lot of times what happens is when you're put in these particular situations, you look in the mirror, the figurative mirror, and the thing that you see, the thing, I'm not going to say the person, the entity that you see is scaring the heck out of you. And then the first thing we have to tell you is that, hey, that's you. That's you. That's you. But it doesn't have to be you. Now's the best time to say, okay, what is it that we want? You know, what is it that I want? You know, and what I mean by that, as you just said, I mean, because basically we know that in this human form, you want peace and you want safety from harm.
1, 2.
But then once you have, my further press back on that is, once you have peace, okay, let's say you have peace, and let's say you have safety or protection from harm. Okay, you got that. Now what? And that's where the prophetic imagination comes into play.
I think you just hit it. That's where the rubber meets the road. And that's when it's like, now, am I going to stop telling these stories that I always tell about myself? Right. I'm like this and I'm like that and all this, you know, and like a lot of that is story making.
Right.
It's not based on false things. These are real events in your life.
And I know we need our stories, because stories are so important to us. Is how we make sense of, you know, the world around us. I mean, we have our movies that we love to watch, and, you know, there's nothing like a good story. The Bible is full of them, you know, full of parables and stories and how we live, you know, just.
Yes, and I want to make sure, be very clear, I believe in the power of story. That's my thing.
Most definitely,
and
yeah.
So like, but I'm talking about like these, like, just to give you guys an example before, as we give you this meditation or homework, whatever you want to call it, to think about what is it that you really want? What is it that you perceive happening? And we're not talking about fantasy land kind of stuff, because as Jason just said, you know, safety. These are like bottom line things that everybody can agree on, whether you live in China, you know, Tanzania, or the United States. But what we're really talking about is perception, honesty, and positionality. Mm-hmm. Like, how honest are you? How many of your stories are embellished? Yeah, I love embellished stories. Don't get me wrong. That's not the point. The point is, if you really want to move into that next thing, then you've got to be brutally honest with yourself about how much of this is what I've been told, how much of this do I keep repeating to myself, especially when it's not serving any purpose in your life. It's not giving you agency,
Right.
you know.
And
And
I'm most definitely there in my life, in my 35 years of living. And as I approach that, now it's having the courage to act on my truth,
there it is.
knowing that I live in a context with other people who are, how do I say it, lying to themselves. but the truth of the matter is, if I were to come out and live it and speak it, there are probably a lot more who are saying, man, I feel the same way. Or
Absolutely.
yeah.
Or, and then there's also this, I mean, we could go on for all day long, and I know we got to wrap it up at some point, but then there's that other aspect of people. Some people just keep busy, right?
Yeah.
And because they had to be doing something.
Yep.
And so, I was like that, I went from thing to thing, flower to flower, move. And I gleaned a lot of benefits from that. But at the same time, it's like, how I've been thinking about doing a podcast, a broadcast, all that kind of stuff for years.
Right.
I'm like, oh, well, I got to first solve this theological problem, or I first got to develop this or earn that degree and all that, and so finally I'm like, all right, I'm starting my doctoral program and a podcast at the same time. And like,
right.
we're going to make this happen.
Yeah. Nothing to it but to do it.
That's right. Yeah. All right, so I'm gonna leave you with one more quote just to like chew on, and we'll come back to it next week. This is also because the last thing I want to say about Walter Brueggemann is everything we're saying. Just take a moment right this second, and then allow this to like sort of be the icing on the cake. All right, so here's what he says. The hypothesis I'm exploring with the prophetic imagination is this: the task of prophetic ministry is to nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness and perception alternative to the consciousness and perception of the dominant culture around us. Now, to say it one more time, the task of prophetic ministry, or the task of being able to see into this portal we're talking about, is to nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness and perception alternative to the consciousness and perception of the dominant culture around us.
Yeah. Oh, we're going to talk about that one the next time. Most definitely, because I got some that's natural to transitions. What you just read, what he just said is it's a secondary consequence, as Bishop Ash would say. It's a secondary consequence of what happens when you get to the fringes or the borders of one reality as you step into the next. It's just natural for that to happen.
And don't be afraid of it. There are guides in this path.
Most
there will
definitely
always be, when you're ready to hear something, somebody's going to appear. I forget what the real quote is.
When the student is ready, the teacher will appear.
That's right. And the teacher doesn't necessarily have to even be a person or a podcast, but we welcome you here. We're glad you're here. And we hope that you'll consider supporting us on Patreon so we plan to get into so much stuff, you guys. But, Jason and I, we've known each other for years, and, not that long, but we've known each other.
Yeah, we have.
And one thing it is, we talk about this stuff all the time. And the biggest problem we had when we first were thinking about doing this podcast was, we need to hold back though. And we need to, release things like over time, get to know our audience and that sort of thing. It's like, we want to cover all this stuff like right away. There's so much stuff we want to jump into. And so we do need your support and your help to keep this broadcast going. I'm an impoverished PhD student now. There are,
I'm a young dad with 3 kids and a wife.
So, but we know, and that's why we've really answered this call, because we do know that we are going to bring this alternative consciousness, to this world. And this dialogue, this dialogical experiment that we're doing here, it's not just about us. It is about birthing whatever it is that you want, and what is it that you want to see. So that's your homework. If you want to support us, we do have a page at Patreon. That information will be connected to this podcast. And you will also have access through, so right now we're hosting this podcast on my website, avipenhollow.com. So it's A as in Apple, V as in Victor, IPENHOLLOW. All right, avipenhollow.com. And you'll find a section there for podcasts. There'll be information there as well. We're also on Facebook, the Proximity Portal. And it's just going to keep rolling. I know that we're now on Spotify. We're on Google Podcasts. We'll be on iTunes soon, but yours truly here lost his Apple ID. He's got to go through that whole ridiculous recovery process before I can get us put up on there. So it's coming, you guys. So I really appreciate those who've already jumped on. And I'll thank you personally at the beginning of the next broadcast. Jason, I love you, sir.
Love you too, man. I'm glad we're doing this, and there's many great things to come. Can't wait.
All right. Until then, you guys, we'll see you in proximity on the other side.
Peace.